Third parties and Nintendo consoles have always had an interesting relationship. I kind of brushed up on this topic a little bit yesterday, but I feel like it's worth another discussion. Maybe a little bit of a deeper one. The whole theme behind my video yesterday was that Nintendo has never really been the haven for third-party companies. Or at least I shouldn't say never, but at least since the Wii generation. Nowadays, it seems very clear that people only are interested in Nintendo consoles for the Nintendo IPs. I say only, but obviously I mean mostly by a very large margin. But believe it or not, at one point that wasn't necessarily the case. We're gonna go back in time for this one. So when the NES came out in the 80s, third parties were clamoring to get their games on there. Between the NES and really all of the consoles of that generation, third parties wanted to be on there because they wanted to be on the home console so they can make some money. It was very clear. You'd get a few brand exclusives obviously, but oftentimes they would make different games for different consoles and both consoles would get the treatment from the third parties. This continued on with the SNES, despite the fact that pretty much everybody that grew up with the SNES that's a hardcore Nintendo fan has fond memories of playing Super Mario World, Zelda: A Link to the Past, Yoshi's Island, Super Metroid, that whole first party lineup. You have an equal number of people that remember all of the amazing Capcom games that were on the Super Nintendo, the amazing Square Enix titles. All of the big franchises were on there selling their games on the console. The Super Nintendo was very comfortable for third parties. But then we made it to the 64-bit era when the Nintendo 64 came out. And all of a sudden, third parties were not as common on the Nintendo 64. Because the Nintendo 64 was much more difficult to develop more, and specifically was much more expensive to have your game on because you had to throw it on a cartridge instead of the CD player which everybody was using. And by everybody I mean Sony. So a lot of those franchises that would have otherwise just carried on moving along with Nintendo would jump ship for a very clear reason. They didn't want to have to spend more money to get that game on Nintendo's console. Because why would they give up a large fraction of their earnings? Now, the 64 still had a fairly healthy showing of third-party titles, but it was laughable in comparison to the Sony PlayStation 1. And that's a big reason why so many people that are Nintendo 64 fans specifically became nostalgic about the same games. That's kind of where it started. By that point in time, the library was so small and so focused on first-party titles that it became almost kind of like a calling card, like fraternity or like a cult, I guess. I don't know what word you want to use. We all played the same games on the Nintendo 64, or at least to an extent. And for the most part, they were first-party titles, and they became very dear to us, these franchises, these IPs. Whereas if somebody grew up with the Sony PlayStation, you grab 3 people, 4 people, 5 people together, tell them all to list out the top 5 games that they played as a child on that Sony PlayStation 1, and while there might be a little bit of overlap, it won't be nearly as identical of a list as it would be if you asked 5 Nintendo 64 owners to do the exact same thing. It is entirely possible that you grew up with Sony and your best friend grew up with Sony, and both of you have 2 very different memories of what a Sony game is. Because PlayStation, whether it was the first-party titles or the third-party titles, was a much broader and much more diverse library. And it is largely because of the third-party support, which had everything to do with the type of hardware that the game was sitting on. And that's why the PlayStation 1 outsold the Nintendo 64. Now in the following generation, it got a little bit better. The GameCube actually saw a lot more third-party support than you would have seen in the previous generation, as well as in the upcoming ones. The GameCube actually had better graphical fidelity in many ways than the PlayStation 2 did. The third-party turn-up was so strong during that generation on all 3 consoles, that being the Xbox and the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube, as well as even the Dreamcast, which had an amazing launch lineup, that till now, when people look back on that generation, regardless of which of those consoles they owned, there are very similar fond memories across all of the platforms. And owners of the GameCube were no exception, unlike what you would see moving on. That was the last true time where Nintendo fans felt like they were part of the same party. They got the same third-party representation on their console that the other guys did. Now, this isn't to say that you weren't still extremely fond of the first-party lineup on the GameCube. There is obviously a lot of affinity for the first-party games that came out during that era, but there was still a lot of excitement for the GameCube. But the issue is, the GameCube had the mini DVDs, which also slowed it down a bit. Actually, it slowed it down a lot. Nintendo got a lot closer with the GameCube than they did with the Nintendo 64, but the GameCube still struggled to keep up with the Xbox and the PlayStation 2, who were still getting more representation, causing the GameCube to not perform nearly as well as a console in that generation. Look, there are a lot of moments in Nintendo's history where you could see an entirely different company depending on one specific decision they made. The whole fumble between the PlayStation to the 64 is part of it, but I actually think they would have entirely recovered if they decided to not have the GameCube be a purple box with mini DVDs as the games. Now, personally, I'm glad they didn't go that route because it led to some extremely exciting generations forward. But there has been a notable negligence from the major third parties since, and that's because after the GameCube, when they finally did get us to like the DVDs, it was all about the inferior hardware of the Wii and the motion controls. By the time the Wii came out, the image of Nintendo was very clear. It was going to become a blue ocean company, it was going to stay a child-focused console, and it was going to be weaker. Now, it was extremely successful using those tactics, but it was a lot more of a top-heavy success because of the gimmick behind the motion controls. But one thing didn't change was the love for the first-party IPs. The first-party games were always held dear to people's hearts, and until now, of all of the 3D Mario titles, I am pretty sure more people think that Mario Galaxy is the best game of the entire franchise. At least that's what the discourse seems like online. Although that could just be about what year it is and when the nostalgia cycle kicks in. Now, mind you, the Wii got third-party support, but it didn't get like that big boy third-party support. You know, those massive AAA titles that everybody's clamoring for to come to the Switch 2 now, for example. It got minigame compilations and just more children's games because that's what the console was effectively focused towards. And the Wii U was the chance to right many of those wrongs. It would be weaker than the other consoles of that generation, sure. But the idea was if the Wii U could repeat the same types of success as the Wii did, and it's a 1080p console, Nintendo would be able to turn the heads of many of these third-party developers and they could bring some of their larger franchises onto the Wii U, while obviously making some sacrifices during the port, but it would still be a worthwhile venture. The Wii U could have been that console, once again, to bridge the gap, but due to a plethora of reasons like the weak launch lineup, the drastic jump in price from the Wii to the Wii U, and a lot of people being confused based off of the marketing, it was obviously never meant to be. Which brought us to the Switch. Now, the Switch would carry on not only the home console lineage, but the handheld console lineage as well. So there were many third-party companies that were developing for the DS and the 3DS, and they had some excellent third-party titles that came out during that era, or those eras rather, as well as the Game Boy eras before that. Many of those third parties would continue to develop for the Nintendo Switch, and it would have, once again, a strong third-party support. But due to the fact that the Switch was significantly more inferior than the consoles that came out before it, those being the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, and due to the fact that many of the third-party developers that were moving on from the handheld stuff were used to making inferior quality games, at least from a technical standpoint, the Switch became a port machine. They would get tons of third-party support, but it was usually third-party support from 5 to 10 years ago. They would get a whole buttload of indie games, those would be making their way over, and they would fit right in with the whole hybrid angle of things. Remember, this was like prior to the Steam Deck or anything, so for a lot of people, the Switch became their choice of console to use for indie titles. In many ways, the vibes that were brought in from the indie titles were the same vibes that people had when they were on the 3DS and the DS before that, where they would have these weaker games and they'd be able to take them with them wherever they go. And since they were weaker games, that meant that your Switch had a longer battery life as well. But for many of those stronger titles, they weren't the current gen titles. Once again, you had a console that was too weak to keep up with the demand that people had for the high-end AAA third-party titles. And once again, you had another generation where people just became more and more passionate about the main IPs. And now we move on to the Switch 2. And there's this idea going around that people just assume that because this is a slightly stronger console, all of a sudden this is going to be the breaking point for the Nintendo library to finally be filled with third-party titles. But I just don't see it. Number one, it's still weaker than the competition. It's not nearly next gen if you put it side by side by the high-end consoles as well as PC games now, which are significantly more prevalent than they used to be. Or rather, there's significantly more synergy between the PC games and the console gamers. And that's not even to account for the upcoming PS6 and the next Xbox console, which will surely be out within a couple of years. In my last video, I downplayed the keycards because in my mind, I'm like, there's no way out of this for Nintendo. It is a first-party console now because of everything that's occurred in the past. But even if there was a chance, even if hypothetically speaking, the Switch 2 was just so amazing that now is the time for everybody to enjoy it and third parties to just take off and be the most appealing thing in the world. Just like back with the GameCube, just like back with the Nintendo 64. The type of media sets it back. While the cartridges and the mini DVDs were a detriment for the third parties that wanted to put games on those consoles, the game keycards are now a turnoff on the customer side because people are less likely to invest into those. But despite that, I still don't think the game keycard is going to be the nail in the coffin. I think that nail went into the coffin 15, 20 years ago. That nail is not as important anymore because of how strong digital sales are today as opposed to how they used to be. It's no longer only physical. Digital games are prevalent and they're here to stay, and it's going to be significantly more important than anything else for the majority of the industry. And despite that, I still think there's very little chance that people are buying even digital games when their third parties are involved because they rather play them on other consoles. Everyone knows that's just how Nintendo is. You buy Nintendo for the first party IP. So while yes, the game keycards do have a negative effect on how it's going to play out for the Switch 2, the reason I don't think people buy Nintendo for the third party games is because there has been a precedent set for almost 20 years now that Nintendo has become a first-party machine, and that is more important than anything else at the end of the day, game keycards or not. So yeah, my conclusion here is the exact same as my previous video, but I felt that I wanted to break it down more after reading a lot of the comments. I'm not trying to downplay how bad game keycards are. I'm not trying to defend game keycards. I think they are horrible and they're awful, and they should not be a part of our industry. But I think Nintendo's third-party woes have little to do with the game keycards and more to do with what it means to be a Nintendo console. And there's an image that is not just going to be shaken off because you got up to 4K a decade after the competition. But yeah, that's all I got for now. Thank you for listening. I will catch you on the next one.